context, and this work has come out of various research projects over the years. I was involved with another colleague, Harriet Thompson, as well as many other organizations in establishing and running something called the EU Energy Poverty Observatory, which basically helps set the legal framework, the measurement framework for energy poverty. That is now much more established at the EU level. But I'm also going to talk about my observations, not only about that, but also more broadly around how basically energy poverty is understood and conceptualized and so on within this context. So I should say the first thing I want to talk about is how we understand energy poverty in terms of the definition that we use. Now, this is a very contentious issue. I think Neil really nicely summarized why it is contentious, because it is often then translated into who is worthy of assistance. So in essence, the definition of energy poverty, especially when it becomes operationalized through a particular policy, is inherently political, because it is embedded in particular viewpoints, values, understandings of deprivation, and also who is deserving of assistance, where in fact we recognize, and it's fundamentally then a question of recognition justice, where we recognize injustices to exist. To avoid that issue, that being so political, what we've tried to do is move towards a more all-encompassing definition that also chimes in with Neil's universalist approach, a definition that basically allows us to encompass everyone who is struggling in some way or another with this problem, because from that conceptual point, then you are able to start understanding the policies, the measures, the approaches that are being used. So we developed this definition. Well, I developed this with my supervisor, Brenda Boardman, many years ago, and then we've developed it with other colleagues further down the line. And it has basically 5 elements. And those 5 elements mean that certainly some things are excluded. It doesn't mean that you are always taking everything out of putting everything in the equation. Some things do not go into the equation, and that's caused some tensions, but I will get to that in a moment. So the first thing about this definition is we talk about energy poverty as something happening in the home, so affecting people in their residential dwelling. So it's not about public buildings, it's not about businesses. And then what becomes interesting is whether it's about transport to the home and back. And then this is where we start to enter some interesting debates, because the home itself cannot necessarily be isolated from the rest of society, nor from the neighborhood that it is in. Nevertheless, for the purpose of most analyses, we treat energy poverty as something that is inside the walls of the home. And connected to that is the notion of energy services. So what we try to look at is not the raw energy that arrives at the boundaries of the home. And in that sense, it is not the electrons that come, or even the kilowatt hours that come to the home. It's not even the quantities of oil or gas. It is in fact, or other fuels, it is in fact the conversion of those fuels into services that are useful to the people living in that home. So functions, affordances that allow people to function, to be part of society. And here we talk about things like lighting, heating, we talk about cooking, we talk about things that meet people's energy needs. And there are, again, various ways in which you can define energy services, but it's energy services that are at the focus of this definition. So even here, if you see, there are some political viewpoints that underpin this understanding, but we try to be as all-encompassing as possible. Now, the 3 other elements become more interesting, and the more you go into them, the more things become contentious. The adequate level is, for me, one of the more interesting elements, here we talk about levels of energy services that allow you to function within a given society. So this is where we take inspiration from the capabilities approach. And that adequate level in the case of energy poverty, I believe, always has two elements. One is the very basically materially needed level, a level below which you cannot really survive physically in a biophysical sort of sense, because that means the temperature is either very high or very low, or other properties of the air in particular that you breathe in the home are from an energy point of view, not fit for human health. Beyond that, though, there is a socially needed level, and that socially needed level essentially defines a person's ability to participate in society. And it's always contingent, it's always dependent on the circumstances that characterize a particular individual's relations or household's relation with the society in which they live. So here we may say that whereas in the past, if you didn't have a mobile phone or access to information technology, in most societies, I'm not saying that it's a prerequisite in all contexts, but in most societies, you would have been okay and you would have been maybe considered energy poor. But nowadays, and I can say that certainly in the UK, if you are digitally excluded, you are actually going to have lots of problems, because so many services, so many advantages, so many facilities are actually provided digitally and online. So not being able to access them then puts you at a structural disadvantage. And then you can talk about other elements of what that social level means, and it might be different in Argentina, it might be different in Chile, and for that matter, it might be different in Buenos Aires, or in different neighborhoods even of Buenos Aires compared to somewhere else, and so on. So, or Brazil, or it might be different in Sao Paulo. It might be, not go into the details, but even in the context of the geographical context where you are all based, you might have different situations. I also want to talk about these other two elements around the inability and the secure. The inability is simply people's we tend to treat these elements together. They stem from people's financial circumstances, and sometimes here we may talk about a situation where you are just about managing with your energy, but if you were to be purchasing from financially the adequate level of energy services, then you would become income poor. So that is a circumstance of energy poverty, because you are effectively rationing on other things or energy in order to stay warm. So energy therefore relates to other expenditure items in the household. And here also the other element of this is that it's not only about affordability, but also around infrastructure. And particularly the challenge here is that often there has been this division, particularly between what we call conventionally the global north or the global south, where it's been believed that, if you're in the global south, it's a question around access to infrastructure, poor development of infrastructure, and it's in the global north, it's about being unable to pay for your energy because all the infrastructure there is there, but it's in fact just that some people don't have the money. And what we've been trying to unpack that just to show that in fact that securing of adequate energy is a global phenomenon, and you can have in very many different contexts, you have very, very many different situations. And indeed, even in the UK here, most of the country doesn't have access to gas. Now, unsustainable as gas is, the fact that people don't have it in many areas puts them at a structural disadvantage to those who do have it. And now with the low carbon transition, I'm going to talk about that in a minute. Again, those who have access to better low carbon, cheaper low carbon energy sources are again at a structural advantage compared to the others. So this is sort of another more subtle dimension that we've been trying to bring into the equation.
Stefan.
Now, when we take these, yes.
Are you the slides are frozen?
They're frozen, right?
Yeah.
let me see what happens. So what if I do it like this? This is the problem. Google Meet is not ideal. Let me try again. Do you see this slide now? Do you see like a map slide?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And if I go to this slide, has it changed now?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm not sure what happened. Right. Okay.
Thank you.
So, well, this is a sort of a map of one of the indicators that we've used to show how this energy poverty geography varies across Europe, because I want to talk about Europe particularly. And we use a variety of measures, and I can talk about that later. All of these measures have their own caveats and challenges. One of the measures that is at least available widely is the reported inability to keep the home adequately warm. So that's when national statistical agencies coordinated with the EU ask everybody through a representative sample to say whether they are unable to afford, actually I should say, to keep the home adequately warm. And these are sort of the answers that you get. This is some of the more recent data. I've not mapped the 2020, it came out recently, but we sort of tend to get this geography whenever we look at it. There is a group of countries, and I call it the V, that you get in Europe, and that tends to be the case always for almost all indicators. You get the V in the middle of Europe, going down to that V normally extends to Switzerland and Austria. You have Germany, you have Benelux, you have Finland, Sweden, Norway, Iceland, and those are countries where the energy poverty problems tend to be the lowest. More recently, in fact, the situation has been improving quite radically in countries like Poland, Czech Republic, Slovenia. They've been doing really well in terms of insulating dwellings and improving heating systems. Historically, these countries had much worse energy poverty patterns. Now, outside that V, and Ireland also has a poor housing stock, so some of these indicators you would get much higher values in Ireland. But again, generally Ireland, in terms of the economy and in terms of income inequalities, is doing better than, for example, the United Kingdom. So these measures tend to be higher. These indicators tend to show higher, better values in the Republic of Ireland compared to the United Kingdom. Is this something that a lot of people in the UK aren't even aware of? Around these income, but also general population wealth indicators. So then outside of that, we have countries that are more vulnerable, and this includes France, Spain, the UK, again for a whole range of reasons, and also includes a number of Southeastern European countries. Then even further beyond that are the countries that are most vulnerable, and we do tend to get these patterns repeating all the time. It's countries like Portugal, Italy, Greece, a number of countries in the Balkans, some countries also in the Baltic region being Lithuania, Latvia, not necessarily Estonia, and Cyprus, always one of the most vulnerable countries as well. So again, for infrastructural, historical, economic reasons as well, we tend to get a similar geography of this phenomenon across Europe. Even though the countries in the V zone, right, tend to have the lowest levels of energy poverty, it doesn't mean that they don't have this problem, speaking in terms, at all. And in fact, it has gotten worse in recent years, and particularly this year, we're going to see a much greater expansion. And for those countries, and I can say this as well as someone who's been involved in various discussions around EU energy poverty policies, they have tended to be very skeptical and also very resistant to EU-wide energy poverty policies. And I'm thinking here particularly of Germany, but also countries like Sweden and so on. We can again talk about in detail what that means. Partly also these countries have believed that that these problems should be solved through the social welfare system and not through infrastructural intervention. I'm going to change the slide now. I don't know if you can. Has it changed? Sorry, I can't see the camera.
Yes.
So, yes.
Yes.
Okay. Great. So I described this geography and the problems that we have, and again, these problems are linked to lots of infrastructural challenges, poor energy efficiency, as Neil was mentioning, but also the nature of heating systems. A lot of people don't know that, for example, in Portugal, but also in Cyprus, a lot of people just don't have any heating, even though they do get winters there, and it's bad in winter. I should have also shown, we don't have good data for that, but in summer we also have huge problems, and in fact then the geography changes, but it's infrastructural ability and formations make a huge difference. What we are constantly up against as practitioners, but also as researchers working in this area, is that both in the scientific literature on the subject, but also within policy debates, there tends to be a general, I would say, a whole movement. I'm not going to say call it a movement, but maybe a whole cohort of people and thinkers and so on who insist on framing this issue as either a technical and or a behavioral issue. So it's really about behaviors, as in understood in very narrow terms, of particularly of those who are poor, but also it's about technological measures. So let's just get everything put in, all the efficiency, everything, all of that stuff, and it will work. I come from a political ecology mostly background, and I always tend to see this in very different terms. I think this is primarily a question of politics. It's a question of state and policy failure, first of all, but also it's a question of recognition, justice as well. And then it is very much a question of infrastructure and infrastructural legacies, which are the results themselves of prolonged historical processes. And people don't often like these interpretations because they don't come with easy answers. Obviously, one of the answers is, well, let's insulate homes. And of course, that does help. But how we insulate homes and how we intervene energy efficiency, but also the political economies of that are very important. And again, in various works that I've done, I've tried to show that, even that is is done within a capitalist system, which sometimes perpetuates the same injustices that cause the problem in the first place. For me, the most egregious part of a lot of these debates, and particularly now that they've really expanded, is the tendency to treat the energy poor as needing to be fixed. And somehow it's about their fault that they're poor. And often resilience is seen as the answer. And resilience, from being actually quite a wonderfully complex term that can be seen as a positive aspect, because the poor are resilient, because they've actually managed to deal with this. So they are incredibly resilient, but in fact they are treated as not being resilient, which I think is really interesting here, because it's a very one-dimensional understanding of resilience that is being used. I should also say that we have very widely varying responses across nations, regions, and cities, and as a result of limited resources, awareness, and capacities. And we have situations where decarbonization policies promote further inequalities. Now, with regard to these varying responses, the EU itself has been moving really rapidly in the last 5 or 6 years towards much more common understandings of energy poverty, which then get translated into EU law. EU law, as we know, is not an actual, well, it's not laws, it's directives, and then EU members have to adopt or implement, and that is starting to make a difference in the last few years. And one of the elements of that process is what we call the national energy and climate plans, and I think these are very powerful instruments to fight energy poverty, because they have actually been there are provisions in there for energy poverty. I'm going to talk just for a few more minutes. I do realize I'm I stepped outside my time a little bit, but I won't talk for too long. So in a study that we did with my colleagues Harriet Thompson and Maureen Cornelis, we evaluated the national energy and climate plans of all EU member states according to various energy justice principles. So we looked at whether energy poverty was defined or recognized, whether there were indicators, what kind of measures there were to fight it, whether these measures were disaggregated nationally, locally, whether there was engagement with energy poor people, and so on. And we found that there was quite a wide divergence among member states, with countries, unsurprisingly, or rather surprisingly, actually, it was countries mostly in the sort of Francophone area that comprehensively dealt with this quite well, or not just Francophone, that's sort of what we call the Latin Europe. So France, Spain, Italy, and so on. But also countries like Lithuania and Greece did very well. And at the other end of the scale, you had countries like Sweden, Denmark, Netherlands, and so on. So maybe countries where you don't even have such a big energy poverty problem, but some of them completely chose to ignore it. So really wide range of policies there. And what we did also, we mapped these in a sort of diagram where we distinguish between what we call procedural recognition measures, so measures that are more around the political aspect of energy poverty and the policy aspect, and distributional and spatial, which are more around the resources that households have or need. So effectively, we call them access to justice and access to resources. And again, we got quite an interesting distribution there, where you had some countries that basically saw this as a distributional issue, and they tended to just give more money to it, or they thought just it's about the economy. Others saw it more as a procedural issue and paid more attention to the politics of it. And the distributional was much more Eastern European countries. For me, it was much more sophisticated to see policies that had more procedural, because it's a more challenging element of energy poverty policy, procedural recognition. And there were countries like the ones that I just mentioned, Belgium, Spain, that did well on both fronts. So where would I see the key challenges based on just what I said and where things are moving? So first of all, we are moving. So there's a rapid process where a lot more attention is being given to this across Europe. The UK is different now because it's not in the European Union, but there are interesting processes here as well, even though I would say some of them are somewhat in a different direction. It's not definitely as dynamic as it is on the continent. But where we still have huge gaps in understanding is around gender. Certainly, energy poverty is gendered. Neil has written some really interesting work on that, among others. Around ethnicity as well. So together with a group of colleagues, we published a paper recently where we talked about something called the diversity penalty, where we see clear evidence that some groups are disadvantaged and others based on such lines. And the whole question of ethnicity and race in Europe is not really not widely debated, but also has its own complexities which are not really understood well by either scientists or decision makers. We have the whole question of summertime energy poverty, but also then what happens at the national level. I am also in favor of what I think we need to be discussing is this sort of the energy sufficiency principle. And one of the problems that we have also in Europe is that we tend to think of energy poverty almost entirely in relative terms, but I think we need to think about it in absolute terms. And the definition that I gave is an absolute definition. It has a relative element, but also an absolute. So what would be interesting is to think of an energy basket of services and goods that, the basic energy income, if you like it, that people need and how that might vary. For me, that would be an interesting exercise. There are also these nexus connections, and Neil and I and others are involved in a project that looks at transport, which I think is a really challenging one, the water energy nexus in relation to poverty is very poorly understood. I've just got a paper now coming out on air, but also questions around urban and regional planning. And we have also lots of questions around just transitions, cooperation, participation, but I realize we're slightly running out of time, so I won't go into them. I just want to also draw some attention, if you're interested, to look at our energy poverty dashboard, which is something that we've developed with our colleagues here at Manchester, where we've basically mapped out energy poverty indicators in greater detail, particularly in relation to the private sector. So that might be of interest to you. So there are two websites here that might be of interest. One has one of my latest papers on just transitions, political ecologies of just transition. That's the Energy Studies Net. And Energy Poverty Info is the dashboard where you could find out more about what we're doing there. And there's also my Twitter if you're interested in following me or engaging with me. Thank you very much, and I do apologize for going over the allocated time. Thank you.